I am Louise de la Gorgendier, and I am a professor in the Anthropology department at Carleton, Sociology and Anthropology, who are sponsoring this as the lead players, but there are several other players that have been involved in getting this event up off the ground. I would like to extend a big thank you to the numerous supporters who have contributed to making this event possible financially and in many other ways. Dean Osborne of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences was a big contributor to making this event happen, and I'm very thankful for John's support. The Faculty of Public Affairs, the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, the Department of Law and Legal Studies, the School of Canadian Studies, and the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice. I would also like to acknowledge the support of colleagues, too numerous to mention here, whose advice I sought along the way when planning for this event. One person in particular, though, is Marlene Brancato, who happens to be the administrator of my own department, whose support has been invaluable throughout the past 3 months to make this happen. Last but not least are the 8 student assistants who are present to welcome you this evening at the back. These students literally took over every final organizing detail earlier today when I was unable to be present, so I'd like to thank them as well. Please join me in a big thank you to everybody present, everybody involved. Now I would like to invite Dean John Osborne to say a few words of welcome this evening.
Thanks, Louise, and welcome everyone. I'll be exceptionally brief because you didn't come to hear me, but I do offer a particularly warm welcome to those who have come from off campus this evening on what was not the easiest evening to travel in Ottawa. One of the things I often get asked as a dean, and indeed one of the debates that seems to permeate our society these days, is what is the role of a university in the 21st century in Ontario and in Canada. And I suppose the obvious answer, I'm sure the answer that would come first and foremost to the minds of anyone in the university community, is that universities are places of teaching and research, and I don't think we would argue with that. But where I differ from a lot of other people is I would say universities are much more than places of teaching and research, and some of you will have heard me make a plea for universities as repositories of knowledge and wisdom and understanding. But I would also like to make a case that universities play a role as the social conscience of society. We are the places, and particularly a university such as ours that houses departments of sociology and anthropology, law and legal studies, a very active human rights program, a Landon Pearson Center for the Study of Childhood and Children's Rights. We are places that can act to remind people, and particularly people in Ottawa, where we are, that there are certain inconvenient truths that need to be remembered from time to time. And we're going to hear about an inconvenient truth this evening. So thank you again for coming. Without further ado, I'll pass it back to Louise to introduce tonight's speaker.
I'm honored to be able to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Originally from Dundee, Scotland, Dennis Edney, Queen's Counsel, established his career in law in Edmonton, Alberta after completing his law degree at the University of Northumbria. And might I note, for all the students out there, he did this as a mature student. He began his early legal career by serving clients in the areas of matrimonial and criminal law. Now his practice is characterized by cases involving criminal and human rights law and cases being tried under the new terrorist legislation, which seems to be changing as we speak. The key features of Mr. Edney's legal career have been to understand the law and to seek justice. And in the process of doing so, he has taken on several very difficult cases, the least of not which is Omar Khadr's. Omar Khadr was a 15-year-old Canadian boy arrested in Afghanistan after a firefight with American soldiers and imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in 2002. Dennis was appointed as foreign attorney consultant by the US Pentagon to participate in Omar Khadr's defense. He has appeared at all levels of court on behalf of Omar, including the Supreme Court of Canada and the US Supreme Court, and has been successful each time. He has represented Omar for more than 10 years and has done so on a pro bono basis at great expense to himself and to his family. He has received numerous human rights and other awards for his legal work. Notably, in 2008, Dennis was honored as co-recipient of the National Pro Bono Award, and here we are today, 7 years later, and that pro bono work continues today on behalf of Omar. That award recognized that, and I quote, "The fruits of his labor have not only increased access to justice for one individual, but also impacted human rights the world over," end quote. Dennis was elected bencher by the Law Society of Alberta in 2011. Dennis's talk this evening is entitled, "From Omar Khadr and Guantanamo to the Rule of Law in an Age of Terror." The title encapsulates his struggle to ensure that the rule of law prevails and that poorly understood sectors of the population are given the same treatment as other citizens under the law, under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and under the Geneva Conventions. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mr. Dennis Edney.
Well, as you can see, I have lots of paper here. You know, I originally planned to speak for about 40 minutes, but prior to that, I intended to show you my baby pictures. Seriously, and then I was going to go through my high school reports to give you a sense of the man who's here tonight. But Louise felt that just wouldn't go over here with this particular audience. So I want to thank Louise for being the driving force behind my presence here tonight. I truly am delighted to be here, and I thank each and every one of you. I also note the comment from the Dean. Universities play a role in the social conscience of society. I couldn't agree more wholeheartedly. I would extend that to saying that should apply to all our civil institutions, from human rights organizations to churches, so the rule of law gets applied strongly everywhere. And I'll be talking about that tonight, and I hope in my talk I may prod your conscience. Because I can tell you, I have talked everywhere. I've talked in Argentina. I worked down there for a while. I'm way off script here, by the way. I've talked in Europe. But no more an apathetic area that I've ever talked in has been Canada. I must have talked to thousands. And I've had, for example, I'll give you an example, as I tried to make you so sad and sorry that you will run out and do something, is I've received standing ovations from over 200 lawyers in Vancouver, and not a call the next day. And very recently, I spoke to over 200 lawyers in Alberta, including the Court of Appeal of Alberta. And I got a standing ovation. I was a made man. But I never got a call the next day from anyone. And that has been the journey of Omar Khadr. And so the journey, the subject matter of Omar Khadr is so extensive and complex that my short talk this evening cannot do it great justice. His story, as I always say, touches upon so many issues, from the human to the inhuman, from the legal to the illegal. I could simply sum it up and say that I've never represented anybody like him, who has been so abused and so abandoned by so many who should know better. In a few months, Omar Khadr will soon turn 29 years of age, having now spent almost half of his life in conditions that have raised international condemnation from human rights organizations, from jurists, from the United Nations, and so on, but not by Canada. And in my talks on Omar Khadr, I talk about the right to justice and the entitlement of each and every person to protection from inhuman, degrading, and abusive treatment, simply because they are fellow human beings in this world of ours. And these principles, I suggest to you, are non-negotiable. It is the core value of our civil society. And yet, it was a memo from the Bush administration that declared that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to allegedly captured terrorists on the battlefield, or alleged terrorists on the battlefields of Afghanistan. And the message was loud and it was clear that the rule of law would not apply to any suspect on the war of terror. And it was this memo that introduced Omar to a life of terror behind the secret walls of Guantanamo Bay. And Guantanamo Bay is a place without rules. And it is a place where Omar spent over 10 years of his life, where he had been arbitrarily detained, suffered unjust imprisonment, prolonged solitary confinement, torture, and abuse. And it's a place that I went to a fair number of years ago, and it changed my life. That is why I have not stopped walking from one part of the country to the other, still sending the message of Guantanamo. Because none of us can consider ourselves a civil society when we allow that hellish place on the eastern tip of Cuba to exist. And all the while, Peter MacKay, then Foreign Affairs Minister, on behalf of our government, persisted in telling the Canadian public that he has been assured that Omar is being treated humanely and would take the United States at its word. I read those words in New York, and they started laughing when I used the phrase that they would take the United States at their word, that they're teaching people safely and humanely. This was an out-truth and was a lie then, and today the Canadian government continues to misinform you about Omar Khadr. The fact that torture has taken place in Guantanamo and that Omar has been subject to different forms of torture during his years there is simply a matter of the public record. And one has to look no further than our Supreme Court decision in 2008, that was in Khadr 1, when the court ruled that the US had violated the Geneva Conventions and the Convention on Torture with regards to Omar Khadr, and that Canada had been complicit in that misbehavior. There can be, in my view, no greater betrayal of Canadian values and our standing in the international community than our government having been implicated in something that's so utterly horrible as the torture of a Canadian citizen, a youth at that, Omar Khadr. Yet, and I had taken 5 years of a journey of putting together evidence from Guantanamo Bay to provide to the Supreme Court. And when it gave that ruling, the next day I thought the world would change. But there was no public outrage when the decision came out, and there's been no outrage since. We have never made our government accountable for abandoning our Constitution and sullying our reputation that others have fought so hard over the centuries to protect. And as a result of that, we all have become complicit by our very silence. History tells us that there are some cases that enshrine the defining moments of their time. Omar Khadr's case is one. Future generations will rightly judge our shocking dereliction of responsibility in this matter and our collective failure to extend justice and humanity. And as we have failed Omar, we have also failed our children through bequeathing to them an uncertain future as a result of systemic apathy by citizens and civil institutions. Omar's story provides a frightening lens into the future of democracy and the decline of the rule of law as we once knew it. One has to look no further than the story of Guantanamo to understand how easy it is for a nation and its people to fall into lawlessness. It was in January of 2002 we witnessed on television, many of us anyway, the first shocking images of prisoners hooded and shackled for transportation across the Atlantic to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, much as other human beings had been carried in slave ships 400 years earlier. And many of those prisoners were described by Human Rights Watch as farmers, taxi drivers sold by the Northern Alliance to the Americans. And in preparing for the 27-hour trip to Guantanamo, they would be zipped into an orange jumpsuit, then hog-chained, meaning they were shackled around their ankles, with a waist chain binding their hands to their stomach, with another chain connecting the shackles on their hands and feet. And these chains were pulled so tight, many of those detainees still have the scars. And while waiting to be loaded on a transport plane, like so much luggage, they would then be left hooded and kneeling on tarmac for many hours. Omar recalled losing all feeling in his limbs for several days afterwards. While on the plane, they would be forced into sensory deprivation gear that the US military uses to disorient prisoners prior to interrogations. Opaque goggles placed over their eyes, soundproof earphones over their ears, and a deodorizing mask over their mouth and nose. And they were now ready to be bolted and fully trussed to a backless steel bench for the long overseas flight. And I recall Omar telling me, you know, Mr. Edney, that 3 days prior to leaving, we were not fed at all. And 1.5 days prior to leaving, we were only provided with sips of water. And this, I learned, was to ensure that no detainee would require toilet facilities on the long 27-hour trip to Guantanamo Bay. Just imagine treating your family pet that way. It would not be long before one would be cited for cruelty to animals, which is exactly how they were considered in human beings and entitled to be treated as such. And on arrival in Guantanamo, we saw through the media these captured detainees being placed in open wire cages, which would be their home for many years, irrespective of tropical storms or searing heat. And what we all witnessed silently was not a manifestation of the Geneva Conventions at work, nor was it an act of deportation or extradition. It was far, far worse. It was the unlawful transportation to a world outside the reach of the law and intended to remain so. And introduced to that life of terror behind those secret walls of Guantanamo Bay was a 15-year-old Canadian kid, Omar Khadr. However, Omar's story starts much earlier. At the age of 12, his father had moved the Khadr family to Afghanistan, where he was working as an engineer. And when Afghanistan was invaded by the US, the country was in turmoil, and many sought refuge in the mountain regions of Pakistan, including the Khadr family. However, Omar's father left him abandoned to a small group of Taliban warriors on a compound, promising to return and pick him up. But he never did. And 6 weeks later, the compound was attacked by US soldiers. It was bombed and reduced to rubble. And Omar was the only survivor. And when the dust settled, a Delta Force soldier going by the pseudonym of OC1 stated he saw Omar crouched on his knees, facing a blank wall, screaming from the bomb and shrapnel that had just permanently blinded him in one eye. And OC1 then just shot him twice in the back. And that action in itself, by someone who's no longer participating on the battlefield, assuming he ever was, constitutes a war crime under international law. And 3 days later, contrary to all expectations, Omar regained consciousness at a US naval base, in a hospital in Bagram. And from the moment he gained consciousness, little did Omar realize his troubles had only started. Despite the fact that he was suffering from extensive shrapnel wounds to much of his body, that the bones on his left shoulder and chest were shattered from bullet wounds, or that he was now partially blind, he would be taken into an interrogation room with his hands and feet shackled to a stretcher, leaving him unable to resist the horrors that were soon to be perpetrated upon him. All pain medication was withdrawn in preparation for these sessions. I don't make this up. I drafted an affidavit for the Supreme Court of Canada. I relied upon oral evidence from soldiers, ex-soldiers. I relied upon the very few documents we were able to get. And I spoke with this torturers, which I will deal with as I go on. And when his interrogators didn't like his answers that Omar would give, he would then be forced into stress positions while this 15-year-old boy is lying on a stretcher. That is, when I talk about stress positions, that means his body was placed into unnatural positions. And considering his condition, it caused him agonizing pain and leaving Omar screaming and sobbing uncontrollably. But it was then, at that stage of his pain, that his captors would then shine bright little pencil lights into his eyes, directly into his damaged eyes, causing even more pain and even more damage. And today, Omar Khadr is going completely blind. And Damien Corsetti, who participated in the torture of Omar and who has reached out for forgiveness from Omar, he stated in an interview I was involved in and a documentary I was involved in, said, "We did terrible things to that kid." And when I met Damien for the first time, Damien just couldn't stand himself. He seemed every part of his skin just bothered him. And he said that he was given so much power at the age of 20. And he wanted to show me his tattoo, and he has this big tattoo along the front of his tummy that says, "I am a monster." And I note that recently he was on YouTube making some comments regarding his misbehaviors. And as Omar became more mobile, he would be taken into the interrogation room with a black hood placed over his head with the sole purpose of disorienting him. And Omar described the suffocating feeling he experienced as this hood was wrapped tightly around his neck, nearly choking him, and how he would panic and scream out to his interrogators that it was difficult to breathe. But they would just laugh at him as they brought him barking dogs to snarl at his face as he was covered with this hood, for the sole intention to further terrify a 15-year-old boy. But more significantly, to me anyway, he would be made to stand on his toes in a crucifixion pose for hours at a time, with his arms outstretched on the upper parts of a door jamb and hung by his wrists, so that eventually supporting your weight becomes an unbearable strain. His ankles and feet would swell to twice their size, and movement becomes agonizing and large blisters develop. And every example that I can give you was conducted upon every detainee in Guantanamo Bay and more. And at times while in these positions, Omar would urinate on himself. He would then be untied, and his head would be used as a mop to clean up the urine on the floor. And while he was doing that, he would be threatened with things such as rape and endure other humiliating acts. I phrase it that way because I don't wish to describe what those humiliating acts were. And a former U.S. Army medic whom I cross-examined in Guantanamo gave evidence that he found Omar Khadr chained to the door frame of a 5-foot square wire cage, with his arms suspended above his shoulders, hooded and weeping. Can you imagine that frightening picture of a 15-year-old boy? Imagine your own child. Imagine your own 15-year-old brother and sister being treated that way. And another technique that they called the night shift, every terror technique has a name to it, a sort of nice name. And so Omar was on the night shift in this hospital, where he's required to walk up and down the hallway with buckets of water all night, heavy buckets of water. And some of the very few notes that we were able to obtain from Bagram was by a nurse who said that while he was doing that, his wounds would weep. I recall interviewing a former British Guantanamo detainee in London, England, and he said, "We could hear Omar's cries and moans day and night until we were separated from him. We all felt bad for him as he was just too young." And I also particularly recall a particular story of a U.S. soldier who would come to his bedside in this hospital ward. He'd drop his pants, stick his bum in Omar's face and fart. And anybody who was there, standing by that bedside, thought this was just funny. And the litany of abuses go on and on. And during this time, Omar's principal interrogator, the person who was in charge of the interrogation team, is someone called Sergeant Joshua Claus. You could check him out on Google. And Joshua Claus and his team were so good at what they did, they were promoted to Guantanamo, and so kept doing such a good job that they were promoted to Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And some of you, or many of you, may have seen those pictures out of the prison in Abu Ghraib, where you have this young lady smoking a cigarette. She's a soldier standing on top of naked bodies in a prison. Well, that was a successful team run by Sergeant Claus. And Claus acknowledged that he questioned Omar over a 3-month period for up to 6 hours at a time. Claus later pled guilty in a court-martial to killing 2 detainees in Bagram and crippling 2 others, using the same techniques that he used on Omar. And in his defense before the military prosecution, he said, "I felt pressure to get results." And the US military prosecutors decided that the death of the 2 detainees was spread too broadly for any one soldier to be charged with manslaughter or a murder charge. Instead, Claus was charged with assault, maltreatment of prisoners, and telling a lie. And then he was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment, but was granted immunity on the basis he would give testimony about Omar's confessional statements under his care. I've also met Claus and talked to Claus. Imagine the price of killing 2 people. 6 months, conditional sentence, so long as you tell us what he said while you were torturing him. And Joshua, Claus, in a rare moment of truth, admitted that he used his interrogation methods more with Khadr than with anybody else, which says so much about that individual who preferred to abuse and torture a child more than an adult. I met Claus. The first time I met Claus, he got off the plane with me, going before the so-called, in preparation for the so-called kangaroo trial that Omar participated in. And he was greeted by about 5 other soldiers. And he was dressed in black pants, black shirt. And he was greeted like he was some kind of hero. And he acted like a hero. We have actually figured out that Claus had interrogated Omar Khadr at least 32 times. And it was under those conditions that Omar was forced to agree that he had thrown a hand grenade that killed a Delta Force soldier, Christopher Spear. That is the sole evidence against Omar Khadr. I say to you that it goes against the very core of humanity, about who we are, that the torture and abuse of anyone, let alone a 15-year-old, would take place in a hospital where people are at their most vulnerable. I have always viewed hospitals as sacred places. And whatever horrors he experienced in that hospital in Bagram followed him to Guantanamo Bay. And I recall Omar saying to me early on, he said, you know, the predominant cry in that hospital was the cry of pain from the interrogations that took place in the rooms next to the beds. And it was then that I realized that this hospital ward was nothing but a torture chamber. And I never thought that in my lifetime I would end up in a torture chamber. I thought of myself as a tough lawyer, had done some pretty high-profile trials. I've done all kinds of terrorist trials, both IRA and Canadian. Yet, what I saw in Guantanamo changed me and drives me to send the message out. And I recall my first meeting with Omar. He had been moved from the cages to one of the 3 secret prisons that there are in Guantanamo Bay, that the Pentagon describes is being used for enhanced interrogation techniques. That's the phraseology, which is code, of course, for torture. And he was in a cold, concrete, windowless cell that was bereft of any personal possessions or anything to make his solitary confinement bearable. It simply contained a metal cot and a chair. And he had been there for at least a year before I had visited him. And it was just prior to entering that cell that a military officer decided to let me know that he had withdrawn into himself and hadn't spoken to anybody for months. They had just left him there to rot. In fact, when I left that cell on the first time, I spoke with a Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs official, a senior person. And I said, if we don't get him out of there, he's going to die. And he or she, because I don't wish to identify that person, agreed with me. And so your government knows anything I'm telling you, your government knows in spades. It just doesn't wish to acknowledge the truth. And sitting there, chained to the floor, was the tragic figure of a young boy looking so bereft and tragic. He shivered. Actually, what he reminded me of was a broken bird. He was in a mess in terms of his physicality. He was shivering. Sometimes it would be a blanket and a mattress. Other times it wasn't. The sole purpose of these cells is to keep them so cold that you don't rest. And we keep the lights going 24 hours a day. In fact, a CIA memo described the use of constant cold and light as an effective method in applying pressure and increasing anxiety in prisoners. That's a quote. And I was shocked at the sight of this figure, this lonely, lonely figure. And I recall having a difficult time controlling my emotions. I remember gasping. I just couldn't believe what I was witnessing. Because I was a father. And I had young children. And I knew that they were at home in the safety and comfort with their mother. Yet here before me was this young boy abandoned by all, by everyone, who received no information on the outside world, no communication from family or friends, no visits from human rights organizations because it's not permitted, or even visits from Canadian consular officials. That wasn't permitted either. And he wasn't even aware when I arrived there that his father had died. And that first image of Omar haunted me for years. This so very dejected, lonely child, abandoned by all. And every time I left Omar after a visit, I was aware that the fluorescent lights in his cell would remain on, that he would try to sleep the time away, and that the cold in his cell would prevent sleep, and that incessant lighting had divested him of his feel for night or for day. And over the course of any given month, Omar didn't know whether he would get to see the sun, have a conversation, or even have another visit from me. And throughout my years of visiting him in Guantanamo Bay, I never, ever saw him walk. He was always shackled to a floor. A military dossier that we obtained records that as a result of the unrelenting maltreatment of Guantanamo detainees, there have been several hundred suicide attempts. And the only way you can commit suicide in Guantanamo is if you chew on your wrists. You are so tied down, so chained, so protected. And a high percentage of detainees are on antidepressants. And the dossier reports that at least 100 have become observably mentally ill as opposed to just depressed. I remember one time going by some cubicle, by the cages, and I heard this man pray. But I'd never heard such desperation in anybody's voice as that time. This Muslim was praying to his God, to Allah. But the pain in that voice stunned me. That cry in that that prayer was just astounding. And Omar Khadr is often referred as a terrorist who committed a heinous crime by our government, and that he pleaded guilty to charges without any backdrop to that plea. Let me be clear here. The American military tribunal at Guantanamo Bay that convicted Omar was not a normal court, and that's a massive understatement. It was a pantomime of justice, removed from the normal American legal system and relying upon made-up rules and novel legal interpretations. Some would say it was simply a kangaroo court, one worthy of a Middle Eastern dictatorship or Kafka short story. I go with the latter. Or as the Alberta Court of Appeal recently stated, in dryly damning language, the legal process under which Khadr was held and the evidence elicited from him have been found to have violated both the Charter and international human rights law. That's from the Alberta Court of Appeal. And the Supreme Court of Canada said as much both in 2008 in Khadr 1 and 2010 in Khadr 2. And the main evidence against him was a confession, as I earlier said, obtained years earlier under what any reasonable person would describe as abuse or torture. But your government doesn't talk about that. And before he pled guilty, I can tell you, it was made very clear that indefinite detention was on the table. That he faced, regardless of what the jury came out with, he faced indefinite detention. And at that point, he'd been nearly 10 years in Guantanamo, held in places that were entirely removed from the realm of law, where abuses and torture were standard operating procedure. And so who amongst us would not have taken that plea bargain to escape the waterboarders and the torturers? I can tell you, I had a hard time persuading him to take that deal. I breached every ethic as a lawyer. The only thing I didn't do was knock him down and hold him to the ground and force him to write and sign his name. He didn't want to plead guilty. He didn't want to go back to Canada as a terrorist. And I persuaded him that things would be okay when you get back to Canada. And on Omar's return to Canada almost 2 years ago, the Canadian government, in their wisdom, classified him as a maximum security risk, not only to Canada, but also to each and every prisoner in any prison in Canada. This 15-year-old guy. I remember being annoyed in Guantanamo Bay saying to military officers, are you telling me this is the only serious Taliban player in this prison? There's nobody else to put up for trial? And yet, our government made that security classification of him in the face of irrefutable evidence that I provided to Vic Tays in the transfer application that took place, including reports from authorities at Guantanamo Bay and Department of Foreign Affairs reports that described him as a good kid. I've just filed an affidavit in the Court of Queen's Bench in Edmonton as I'm making one of my numerous challenges. And in that affidavit is a record of everything I'm telling you, proof of everything I'm telling you. And since his arrival in Canada, Omar has been placed in some of the most notorious prisons. He was initially placed in Millhaven Penitentiary, and because he's such a terrible, dangerous individual, we locked him away for 7.5 months in isolation. Welcome to Canada, Omar. And then a guard, when he got let out, a guard asked him to work on the food line. and pass out pieces of butter to these serious prisoners and make sure they only got one each. Well, you have to understand the culture of you have to be a tough guy in a prison, or you better align yourself with tough guys. And so here's this innocent put on a food line, which is one of the most dangerous areas in prison. It's where drugs pass, it's where messages pass. And here's this young man that tells this hard, seasoned killer that he can only have one little bit of butter. So sad and tragic, really. And what does this guy try to do? He tries to stab him and then puts a contract on him. And so Omar is then put in isolation again, and I use that situation to get him moved to Edmonton, Alberta, to Edmonton Max. And what did we do in Edmonton Max? Well, he's a Muslim. What do you do with Muslims? You put them on white supremacist units so they get the shit kicked out of them within the first 5 minutes. So badly that the warden called me personally at my house on a Saturday night to come out and see him. And that was a terrible day, because I had never seen Omar so sad and so scared. He had put his trust in me, agreeing to enter into a plea bargain so he could return to the safety of Canada. And I was then faced with the sober reality that not only could I not keep him safe in Guantanamo, I couldn't keep him safe in Canada. In chronicling Omar's ordeal, I'm not simply describing shameful and appalling behavior towards a young Canadian youth that should shock the conscience of each one of us, or that he has managed against all odds to maintain an enduring faith in our common humanity, or that his truth has been able to leap prison walls and barriers because the government will not allow him to be heard. It is only by creating a climate of fear that it is easy for people such as you and I to accept that drastic measures must be taken in the interest of security, even if it means the suspension of civil liberties, compromising our values, or ignoring the rule of law. We realize that, it's just simply for the greater good of society. It is then that we all fall into the lawlessness that gave us Guantanamo Bay. Recently, on giving public notice that it is preparing legislation to allow extensive surveillance of its citizens by its intelligence agency, CSIS, Prime Minister Harper was quoted as saying, "It is that judges have constrained the agency's powers in the name of preserving liberties." And that resonated with me, because there was similar language used by the Bush administration in setting out its national defense strategy in 2005. Because I recall what he told the American public. He said, "Our strength as a nation state will continue to be challenged by those who employ a strategy of the weak by using international media and judicial processes." And in Britain, around the same time, Tony Blair, on the point of leaving office, stated, "It is a dangerous misjudgment to put civil liberties first." And they could all, each and every one of those individuals, could have benefited from the experience of Stella Rimington, former head of MI5, the British Security Service, who oversaw the IRA problem. And I represented at one time a famous IRA terrorist. And he was the real business. And she criticized not only her own country and other countries' reaction to 9/11 as simply as excessive. She stated, It would be better that the government recognise there are risks. And rather than frightening people to pass laws which restrict civil liberties, precisely one of the objectives of terrorism, that we live in fear and under a police state. Or they could have benefited from the wisdom of the US Supreme Court Justice William Brennan in 1997, decrying past history. What did he say? He said, "There is considerably less to be proud about and a good deal to be embarrassed about when one reflects on the shabby treatment civil liberties have received in the United States during times of war and perceived threats to national security. And after each perceived security crisis ended, the United States has remorsefully realized the abrogation of civil liberties was unnecessary. But it has proven unable to prevent itself from repeating the error when the next crisis comes along." And I much prefer the view attributed by Benjamin Franklin, that he who would put security first before liberty deserves neither. In combating terrorism, we are fighting for more than the safety of our citizens, although that is an important objective, of course. We are also fighting for the preservation of our democratic way of life, our right to freedom of thought and expression, and our commitment to the rule of law. It is only by adhering to the rule of law are we able to define the boundaries of permissible and legitimate state action. For what it's worth, I would never have envisaged that the history of the new century would encompass the destruction and distortion of fundamental legal and constitutional principles that have been in place since the 17th century. We appear to have forgotten the lessons of the 17th century Star Chamber, where the accused were submitted to torture, to accusations based on secret evidence, heard by a secret court, while being shackled in the extremes of isolation. And the worst excesses of the past year should have sounded loud alarms to each and every one of us, not the least because of that precise historic parallel to the Star Chamber. We are witnesses to habeas corpus being abandoned. I know that. I appeared in the US Supreme Court fighting for habeas rights for detainees in 2004. Guilt inferred by association, torture and rendition nakedly justified, and vital international conventions consolidated in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Geneva Conventions, the Refugee Conventions, and the Torture Convention, and more. They have all been deliberately avoided or ignored in the war of terror. I go on forever. But worse, far worse, as I stated earlier, we bequeath this social legacy to our children. So as I conclude, the story of Omar Khadr is not just about a boy, a young boy who was detained and abused. This story is also about us, about how we as individuals define ourselves as a society and what we are prepared to stand up for. If this could happen to a 15-year-old Canadian youth who is entitled to all kinds of international and domestic protections, then who is safe amongst us? And if we walk away from our duty to uphold human values, then who will be there to speak for us when our turn comes? Thank you.
I've been following Omar's story ever since, was 2006, when he first was transported to Guantanamo. So one of my questions, actually the one question that I really want to ask you is if you guys are actually going to sue the Canadian government for reparation for what Omar Khadr has gone through all of these years. and because of the complicity of the Canadian government with the United States in terms of violation of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And like you said at the end, if this can happen to a Canadian-born child, then I don't know, I guess we're doomed. So I'm just wondering if there's going to be a federal lawsuit against the federal government.
Well, if I understand your question, let me tell you that you cannot sue for torture in the United States. Let me finish. It cannot be, any public figure is not made accountable. And I started at the outset a civil lawsuit against the government.
Okay.
And prior to starting a civil lawsuit, I had sent many letters to the Canadian government asking them, where is this kid called Omar Khadr? What do you know about him? And I started this wonderful pen-pal relationship. It seemed to be pretty one-sided. And so then I started a civil lawsuit but for $20,000, and then used that to get some disclosure, solely to get disclosure. And didn't do anything with that for years because I've been busy fighting in different courts. Am I answering your question to some point?
Well, I was talking more about the Canadian government because there has been some victims of torture that it was the Canadian government who sent them to Syria, and specifically one person who had actually reparation by the Canadian government for a sum of about $6.7 million.
You're talking about Arar, Maher Arar. Yeah?
I'm pretty sure, yes.
Okay. So anyway, just let me tell you then, just very briefly, because we have now continued that civil lawsuit because I hope someday to be able to find the names of various people in the Canadian government who were involved in going to Guantanamo Bay over a period of time, not just visiting Omar, but other people. And I hope to be able to, through examination, be able to have some of the answers that I've been looking for years. Okay?
Thank you very much for what you're doing for Omar.
Thank you very much.
God bless you.
I'm a lawyer, but I don't do criminal law. I have had the privilege of teaching a course once to students at Algonquin College on the Canadian legal system. And generally feel proud when I talk about the history of law in this country and the development of our Constitution and Charter and human rights law, in which we lead in Canada in many ways. Just think of gay rights, women's rights, a number of civil rights as well, criminal accused rights as well. But since particularly Harper's government, but prior to that, what we're seeing is a real deterioration in our role, degradation of our role, and it's shameful, of course. We see it in the examples you gave. But it's frustrating to see our government tie itself so closely to the American system, which is ruling in Guantanamo. So I guess I have got a second question coming up, but I just feel very frustrated when the government of the day in this election year also seizes the fears that you've talked about that allow for simplistic solutions to grant even greater powers to the police organizations, the so-called security organizations, and it seems to be popular. It's working. It's giving them greater support, and people looking for simple solutions, believing that the breach of private liberties is justified, seem to be backing it. So I'm not sure what we can do and what you're asking us to do. So I'd like to hear more about what you are asking us to do, other than talking about it with people. But okay, I also, can I just put my second question to you, and it's a briefer one. It was about the military courts. I think I heard you say that Omar was the only one who has been tried and found guilty, but there were surely others.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
That actually have been 779 detainees in Guantanamo, and over 600 have been released quietly without charges. There have been 7 trials or plea bargains, and that's it. And all those years in Guantanamo and all those people. So I didn't say that. I heard you. I understand your frustration, but your comment is, what are we to do? That's not for me to tell you.
No, I agree.
You know, we have all these civil institutions in which you're involved in that are there to ensure that fascism doesn't creep into a society and break down. And what are we doing? There's very few lawyers out there fighting, taking on charges, making the government accountable. We are powerful people as lawyers. We are dissatisfied with the dean's work, I'll take him to court. I get my day in court. Doesn't want to talk to me, I'll take him to court. We have to empower ourselves. I was recently stopped by a young lawyer that I had trained. Hadn't seen me for about a year or two, and what did he say to me? It's great to see you, Dennis, he said, and almost immediately said, you know, I made $400,000 last year. And in the same breath he said, you know, I hope I never do the work you do. I speak to law schools everywhere. And am I satisfied? I'm absolutely disappointed. You could put together your students and you could decide upon a particular case that you want to assist in. University of San Francisco does that all the time. I have a lot of relationships with the University of San Francisco. Your students are given someone who's on death row and they work with that. They get to understand real justice, how to go about getting justice. I've said to law students in Alberta, ask your professors, do they know me? If you don't know me, then you haven't read the books. I've been in the Supreme Court at least 7 times. I've changed the criminal code years ago, and I've extended the extraterritorial effect of the Charter to provide rights for everyday Canadians. And who am I? I'm just a former little lawyer who did family law and some criminal law. But I'm powerful. I'm the guy who came out of Guantanamo saying to Omar Khadr, I will not leave you. And so I decided to take on governments because being Scottish, I'm a bit thick. And I've had resounding success, particularly from Canadian courts. So you have an obligation, when you have students under you, particularly as a lawyer, to go out and fight. There's all kinds of challenges. You don't like the anti-terrorism legislation? Then get together, contact Amnesty International. They've asked me about wishing to take intervener status. There's all kinds of challenges that we could take to ensure that the rule of law has been upheld. The problem with Germany, you've got me going here, the problem with Germany in the Second World War, and Angela Merkel talked about it, is that here was this shitty little guy who couldn't get a job called Hitler, and within a very short period of time, all those civil institutions that are the same as we had, powerful civil institutions, they crumbled. Through fear, power, and racism. That's what we have to challenge. It's our country. Thank you.
Thank you.
I got arrested here.
Hi.
I want to hear your voices. I've had to put up with the snow. I've got my shoes wet. I want my money's worth.
I've been following the Omar story for a while, but I'm just wondering what is in it for the government to make these young men suffer and go through all this and just complicitly support the U.S. in everything that's happened to these young men? What is in it for our government to keep doing this and ruining basically sort of Canada's name by, making things worse for him?
Well,
keep Omar in this position.
I can give you my own particular view,
Yeah, that's what I wanted.
but what is your view?
I think race has a lot to do with it, but I think also I just don't get Harper government quite well. I don't know why we voted for him.
So what are you going to do?
Well, for one thing, I'm never voting for him. And I don't know what to do, really.
Look,
But
this is your world. You're young people.
I'm actually old, but
Please, please. I'm sorry? What did you
You
say?
have to speak up.
I said I'm actually old. You said I was,
Okay. Well, you're medium old compared to me. This is your world. You're entitled to it. You should own it. You should challenge your professors politely. You should challenge, question, make changes. We haven't left you. We've bequeathed to you a mess out there. I can go on forever. We're worried about ISIS, but we don't talk about the fact that we've been at war for 34 years, I'm talking about the U.S., with the Middle East. And along the way, we have killed hundreds of thousands and created widows and children and destroyed infrastructure. We don't talk about that when we talk about a problem. To understand a problem, particularly as a family man, when I have a problem from some of my children at times, I've got to understand what went on at school and various other things. So, but then you have to take control. Don't look to me to tell you. I told you I've been everywhere. I don't have the answers for you. All I know is I go out to temper power. You could walk down to your local politician who's going to be knocking on your door to run again for the election and tell him that unless he commits himself to human rights and civil rights, that you're going to go and knock on other doors and tell people not to do it, to vote against him. You have power. You have thousands of different ways of letting your power out. I gave a lecture in London not so long ago. And I had this little lady with a bag who was an activist taking me around on the subway. She was beautiful. She was in her late 60s, but she was doing something. It's apathy in this country, apathy amongst you students, because it's your world now. We've messed it up. Change it. You're entitled to do that. If you're not getting the answers you need or the guidance you need, then challenge that, complain about it. I have said, go and knock on the doors of your politicians and challenge them about why they're taking the stand. I can tell you that every Conservative MP has been given a little script when he's asked about Omar Khadr. And I could only tell you that when I've talked to, and I spoke to a fair number of politicians, once you get beyond the sound bites, there's not a lot there. So challenge, go out there. Stop being lazy. Thank you.
As you pointed out, being a thick Scot, interestingly, it's your tenacity to stick with Omar Khadr is just rather inspiring through all of this. My broader question is whether lawyers who participate in trials such as these military commissions and in these trials that are often politically and where the script is dominated by the government, if that participation renders them complicit in the injustices that inevitably unfold or that may happen to unfold. And I was just hoping to have some reflection on that notion or those ideas.
Well, first of all, you said thank me for my tenacity.
I did, yes.
Thank you. But you know, I gave up a lot to fight for Omar Khadr. I was all set. I had a nice partnership. I knew how much money came in. I knew I could go home and look forward to weekends, etc. And in my journey for Omar Khadr, I've missed 2 high school graduations. And why? Not because I'm a nice guy. Not because I'm a human rights guy. I was never a human rights. I have values. Values that I have. My father was a long-distance truck driver, so I had his values. And I just knew it was wrong. And so what should I do about it? Because I couldn't walk away and sleep every night knowing that it was this cell with this young boy in there. Who's going to speak for him? So there are times in life when you're challenged, there's no choice but to go out and do what you think is the right thing. Second part of your question, and I thank you for that. Second part of the question is Guantanamo. There's nothing about Guantanamo that's truthful. I worked on Hamden, who was the first detainee before the Supreme Court. He had a great team. They worked really hard. They were really committed. And every one of those lawyers, whether it was a military lawyer or the civilian lawyer, they were really qualified. The military lawyer was a professor of law and a professor of war. And similarly, I'll stick to that case, because there's very few cases. When I took on Omar and went to trial, so-called trial, he was the fourth one up. I could tell you that I've twice received libel notices from military officers on our team, because you're forced to take a military officer, and they are the front speakers. You just tidy along, and you're supposed to be Canadian and smile and let them mess up. I had lawyers who had never had cases, never done a case in their life. And here we were doing this international law, challenging the very government who put these people there and caused all the problems in the first place. There was a fiction. And so every libel, those two notices, I invited those lawyers out in Washington to please go ahead and continue the action, because I would love to have them and deal with it. So what am I saying? I'm saying that there were those who did the right thing, and there are those who went to Guantanamo and worked, who were just appointed and just toadies. Unfortunately, I met too many toadies. I recall saying to the chief defense counsel for Guantanamo Bay, when I turned up for the trial, and as a trial lawyer, when you look at my office, preparing for a trial, it's a mess, just like academics preparing for classes or doing marks. And I had this pristine office. No one was there. They were all out on the beach. And all the witnesses that I had spent the summer agreeing to come to Guantanamo Bay were not allowed. And so I confronted the chief, as a lawyer, the chief defense counsel about that. I said, no one's doing it. There's no work being done here. He said, I know. So you make what you want of that. There's good and bad and everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question for you is not as Omar as a case, but as a person. I think it's important for us to relate to him as a person, as a fellow Canadian, as a brother, as somebody that we care about. I know we've all read recently in the news about him having plans to study. His eyesight is deteriorating. My question for you is simply, how is he? How is his morale? And on a personal level, what can we do to help him?
I used to hate that question. The reason was because I often thought of myself as a tough criminal lawyer. And so I've never ever said lovely things about clients in my lifetime. But, Omar Khadr is no different than other people that I've worked with who have been tortured. There is a myth and a fear that, particularly south of the border, that if those detainees are released, they're going to cross the water, come to your house and kill you. Well, my overwhelming experience, whether it's been in Argentina with torture victims, whether it's been in Canada or elsewhere, is that they find another level of humanity that I don't have. and they have no anger. I had a call years ago, because we'd sit for hours together, Omar and I, just killing time. And I remember saying, Omar, what do you want to be when you get out of here? And he said, I want to be a doctor. And I said, okay, why? He said, because I want to make sure that no one else is ever hurt like me. And I've heard that comment made in different ways by different people. Omar Khadr, someone described him this way, which I think is beautiful, who has turned his prison into a monastery where he has developed his learning. And I have never, in all the years I've been went to that hellish place and I've been fighting, I've never heard him once say an angry word. I think he'd be a tremendous tribute to our Canadian public, to our society. The problem is the government doesn't want him out because it works against all the propaganda. The moment we have a case on Monday in the federal court, asking the federal court to order the warden of the prison to allow Omar to be allowed to be interviewed by the media. I, as a lawyer, would never allow you or anybody else speak to my client. I don't care now. Speak to Omar Khadr, ask him any question. However, everything about Omar is politics. I've been told that, be careful here, I've been told that the Prime Minister's office phones Bowden Institution every month to check on Omar Khadr. And I believe that because I appeared in court before the Court of Appeal in Queen's Bench of Alberta in December of this year on a habeas that we were successful in. And the Prime Minister had a press conference solely about Omar Khadr an hour before I went into court. Talk about attempts to interfere in the judicial system. But he's a wonderful young man. He's not as young anymore. He's going to be 29. But he's very impressive.
Two questions. One is not the first step to a long-term solution or long-term alleviation of Omar Khadr's situation and an alleviation of our security state the defeat of this government in 9 months' time and its substitution by another party? That's question one.
I didn't understand that.
And question number two is, you've seen lots of audiences, you've seen lots of people in them. I wonder, in this security state, what do you think of the odds that there's a CSIS man or woman or an RCMP man or woman here watching faces and people tonight? That's a question which I'd like you to respond to as well. Thank you.
I'll answer the second
Not
first.
the one, by the way.
Thank you, sir. I'll answer the second question first. I'd be surprised if there's no CSIS agent here. It's an issue that we don't face in Canada, the systemic profiling of Muslims. I deal with Muslims calling me every day. I deal with people from Edmonton who are going on a plane to Phoenix or somewhere, and they're taken to a back room to speak to CSIS. And CSIS has no right to apprehend them, but the message is you won't catch that plane unless you answer my questions. And my question is, that guy Jack that you met last week, what is he doing? I'm just looking for information. I've been in audiences where I recognized an RCMP intel guy, and I've recognized a CSIS, and I've embraced them. I've said, glad you're here. Please make sure you pass my story on to Prime Minister Harper. Okay. What was the first question?
Could you please repeat your
Sorry?
first question?
Canadian government change Omar's situation?
I would hope, considering the rhetoric by the Liberal and NDP in Parliament a few years ago on behalf of Omar Khadr, I would expect that we would see changes. But this government is doing not different than what I experienced when I was in America in 2002 under Bush, 2003. I was there forever. And I was in New York for a year and a half doing a trial. that same politics of fear that Bush did so successfully, the war on terror, we have it today in spades. We know that Muslims are synonymous with terrorists. We know, at least that's what we're told. And we know that as Harper just told us, that this anti-terrorism legislation was motivated by these two individuals who, in October, were killed officers without being provided any information about who they are, how they were motivated. We've expanded the definition of terrorism far beyond. So that's beyond my bailiwick tonight. Thank you.
I just wanted to say two things. One is a question. The first one is I thought I would suggest that if anyone is interested in starting a local conversation or having conversations with me about things that could be done locally to support Omar, feel free to find me and leave me your email address. And the other thing is, I was wondering, I noticed there was a bill that became law recently called the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act, ironically named, which allows the government to strip people of their rights. I just wondered if you could comment on it. I was really worried when I read about it.
Well, I could go on forever telling you what legislation you should be worried about and what's continuing. But what I'd like to say to you is, just recently, this summer, I was in Winnipeg at the opening of the Human Rights Museum there. It was beautiful, multi-dollar place. And I was given an award there. And I talked. But I had better chats in Winnipeg because Winnipeg has little coffee shops where people just go to talk and chatter and argue. They have these are coffee shops just to debate and say something. And you may wish to talk to me about it or just let me ramble on. But I loved it. And so I encourage you. I encourage you to engage your professors. I encourage you to engage your parents. I encourage you, to go engage anybody and everybody about what kind of society they want. And you will face tremendous apathy. Well, it's none of my business. But if you don't do that, then it just gets worse.
Right now, I would like to invite Neil Gerlach, who is our department chair for the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. To me, the Omar Khadr case has always been a measure of the extent to which Canadians feel fear about what's going on in the world around them, the extent to which they're willing to go along with the militarization of our society, the expansion of police powers, the overt dismissal of the rule of law, secrecy, and so on. I want to thank you, Dennis, for continuing to be that principled voice that refuses to allow us to forget this case and forget that these things are going on around us. And I want to thank you very much for coming here tonight in the cold and the snow and so on to speak to us about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.